Homes in the nearby Palmer Lake area and near the Celery Fields also still reeling from Debbie's impact.
There has been so much publicity about Laurel Meadows, an area that flooded, that never flooded before, that was not in a flood zone where homes had 3-4 feet of water. How does this happen? Well, I want to talk about things that people either forgot or were never told. My name is Troy Funk. I'm a real estate broker in the state of Florida. I've been in the real estate business going on 40 years, a resident here for 40 plus years. And in that time, I remember a lot of things that have happened in Sarasota that a lot of new people moving to the area may not know. And I want to share that insight. And I want to be a resource for value. If I am, please hit that like button, hit the subscribe button if you're not a subscriber. So let's talk about the flooding of Laurel Meadows. But first off, I want to take you to a point of reference known as the Celery Fields. Now, the Celery Fields are located on Palmer Boulevard east of the interstate. And what's significant about the Celery Fields? Back when we moved here 40 plus years ago, that was in the middle of nowhere. In fact, I remember Palmer Boulevard being a gravel road and a farmer reporting on the news that somebody had dropped something off on his property in the middle of the night. And when they discovered what it was a dead body. And that's what you would expect on Palmer Boulevard. It was in the middle of nowhere. That's not the case today. In fact, Palmer Boulevard extends all the way to Lorraine Road, which extends to Bee Ridge, which are becoming very busy residential streets. How does that affect the flooding? Well, Palmer Boulevard, from east of the interstate, you have an area known as the Celery Fields. Now, when we moved here, the Celery Fields were historically known as very low-lying areas. They flooded all the time. And what was problematic with that is this being a very low area in the county and with a consistency to flood, this area actually became toxic. And why did it become toxic? Because of all the fertilizer that washed to this low-lying area, the ground soil became toxic and became environmentally hazardous. So as time moved on, what do you do with hazardous toxic dirt? And how are you going to develop this area, especially if you're in a toxic area? Well, you can't just get rid of dirt. Actually put dirt on top of dirt, and they dug out the area to create this massive hill. It's almost like a Florida mountain, but all this toxic dirt was stacked onto each other. I understand there was clay that was put on there, and then good dirt was put on so that toxicity would go away. That led us to a absolutely beautiful park, the Celery Field Park, where you can walk to the top of this hill and see a lot of Sarasota. It's unique because there's nothing quite like that in our area where you have such a high elevation. And then the lower area where it was designed to be low for water retention. The Celery Fields today is a beautiful park, but this was a low lying area. Now, I remember after they built the Celery Fields and cleaned that area up and transformed it from literally a toxic dump to a state or to a park, they started talking about developing Palmer Boulevard and building new homes. And you're like, are you serious? I mean, you know, from my mindset, this was a very low area. And now they're going to start developing this area. And they did. And as new homes were built, the standard was with a newer home that they must have retention areas. So they were built with retention areas to withstand the water that came in there. But that still left Palmer Boulevard very open to still flooding after that time. And it has had problems with flooding. Development kept going in. Well, somewhere later on, Laurel Meadows was built. I do believe when they were built, it was built to standards, the lake and such, but the development didn't stop. It kept growing and growing. And later came Artistry. And when you look at Artistry, which is somewhat adjacent to Laurel Meadows, you can see it's much higher than Laurel Meadows. So Laurel Meadows started to become more of the lower area, in an area that at one point was a low area. Now, when people say, wait a minute, this is unusual, a home of that point would flood when it's never flooded. Well, it's happened before in Sarasota. What happened and what was the result of that situation? I want to take you back to July 1st of 1992, Ridgewood Estates, which is located on Bee Ridge Road. And this was an area where my mother-in-law owned a home, and she had a house built. She lived there, and back in 92, the house was about 19 years old, and she called my wife and myself one day and said, the water is starting to come up on my property. And we had had 2 days of a lot of rain, but this home never flooded. And ironically, when we got there, the house flooded. It had 6 inches of water come in the house, and it wasn't good water. It was filthy, dirty water that we understand there were snakes there, and yet there's people in canoes and swimming in it, and it was just gross. But this house never flooded. It was a 19-year-old house. And now what was kind of, I guess, fortunate in that situation for her was 3 months before the flood and her house flooded, she decided to refinance her house. And the lender required her to get a new survey and determined that her house was in a flood zone. We're like, well, it's never flooded. How did the flood maps change that we were not in a flood zone? Now that we are, we need flood insurance. So she was required to get flood insurance to get the financing, which she did. 3 months later, her house flooded. The flood insurance took care of her, but it did not take care of the majority of the people in the neighborhood that were not aware that they were in a flood zone, and now their house flooded. Now, how did this happen in Ridgewood Estates? How is it that this neighborhood flooded when it never flooded before? And that was the concern at that point, because when we got there, the rain had stopped. There was a lot of waterfall that came from the sky, and of course it was natural to have the streets flood out in the low areas, because Ridgewood Estates at that time did not have lakes. Now, there is a lake in there, but it's not what you see now. Normally when you go into new subdivision, you see a lot of lakes, and you think, well, this is for the aesthetics of the neighborhood. The truth is, it's for water retention. You need lakes in newer areas, because where's the water going to go? When you have all this excess water, you need it to run off. Ridgewood Estates was built without the lakes, so it made sense that the low areas in the subdivision would have water, but we never had water in houses, not to that extent. I'll never forget, because I was with Remax Properties at that time for about 16 years, and there was an agent in my office that had he got a lot of national attention because his for sale sign was in front of his listing that had 4 feet of water, and you could see the for sale sign and all the water. A lot of concern came to this area because it flooded. But why did it flood? Because when we were there, the water was not coming from the sky, and after it stopped raining, the water just kept coming up from the ground. And does that make sense? Now, what happened, and what was the excuse? What was the lie that we were taught? And some say maybe it wasn't a lie, but I have a hard time believing this one. And at that point, we were told this was in the 100-year flood. This neighborhood will flood every 100 years. It doesn't make sense, because what were some other possibilities why this kind of flooded, right? Well, prior to that location on Bee Ridge Road, Ridgewood Estates, we had a new hospital built, Doctor's Hospital, on the corner of Cattleman Road and Bee Ridge Road. We also had a new subdivision called Colonial Oaks built on Cattleman Road, which was backed up to Ridgewood Estates. So we had all this new development that complied with the new floodplains of having lakes and having good water retention. And yet, when all this rain came in, Ridgewood Estates flooded. Yet we were told it was a 100-year flood. This is why this whole area flooded, because it was a natural thing that things will flood every 100 years. Being in real estate, what I remember is trying to absorb, that's the reason. It was a natural flooding of 100-year floods. It's going to flood. As I was selling homes on her street, and I actually sold about 6 homes on the street that she lived on in the period I've been in sales, we'd always put on the seller's disclosure, this house flooded in the 100-year flood, and and it had so many feet of water, but it was 100 years. That's going to happen every 100 years, so it won't happen again. To the best of my knowledge, that Ridgewood Estates after that point has never flooded again, but there were some things that were done that would make that possibility beyond the 100-year idea. As I said, there was a lot of development that went on around that subdivision before this house flooded. The other thing that was kind of awkward at that time, back in 1992, is it became normal to think it's gonna flood, it's okay, it's just a normal process. In fact, there's a subdivision in Sarasota where there's one street, and I had a listing on that street, and it was a property. When I got the property, I got the listing from the bank foreclosed, and they asked me to go out there, change the locks, and it's a beautiful neighborhood. It's an exclusive area, but when you get there, you have to step up about 6 steps to the house, and the garage is low. So, step down in the garage, step up in the house, and then the whole house was on one level, and then the house was, surrounded by lower land. But it was awkward because later on discovering as I'm marketing this property that this home was designed to flood. It was built with the idea that water would come in the subdivision, but it would never hit the house. It could flood the garage out, it could flood the yard out, but it would recede. And we're talking an expensive home at that point, and that became normal to think, okay, you know, we're going to build right into what should be a lake, and we'll call that, water retention coming in and out. And I remember some friends looking to buy a property on that street, and luckily they said no, we're not. You know, it was a good deal too, because here it was a nice house in a nice location, way undervalued for the other homes for that same similar price. But oh yeah, there's one thing, this house will flood, right? So here's what became awkward in the normal idea, like, okay, flooding's normal, 100-year flood, don't worry about it, this is just Florida. There's a subdivision, and the evidence of that is when you're on the corner of McIntosh and Bay Vista is also where we had a lot of flooding, but there's a dam that broke, and there's a lot of issues that caused for water retention there. But that location, there's an area where if you're on McIntosh and you're on Bay Vista and you're heading towards Cattleman Road, right after the light, you'll see a turn lane that turns right into a lake. Well, that seems a little awkward, right? Well, that wasn't always a lake. That's why, because that turn lane turned into a road that surrounded Sherwood Forest and then connected up to Fruitville Road. Now, this is what is significant, because at that point, the idea is that we can build in low areas. What's the problem, right? And we'll just call it, you know, natural occurrence. Well, they started building a subdivision right there at the corner of McIntosh and Bay Vista, and on the other side. Now, today it's a huge lake, but believe it or not, they got approved for city roads or county roads to be put up there. They even built model homes and to start selling that whole area out as new housing, and it was condemned. That whole project was condemned, and these beautiful model homes with beautiful furniture and everything else were destroyed, and that whole area became a lake. It was turned into a lake. There's a big bridge that goes in there, and that became an area of water retention. Now, that's a good thing because, of course, the area around that, when you have water retention, that's going to have less likelihood of rain. So that helped improve the area. The county did some other improvements that I'm aware of to help improve Ridgewood Estates, because Ridgewood Estates, you know, flooded. And now I've also known along this time period that there were certain homes in Sarasota that also got condemned. And an example is, I know on the corner, I believe on Proctor Road, and I think it's McIntosh, there was a little home. It got condemned, and it got condemned to build a lake and a little retention pond. So it became obvious that we need retention ponds in Florida. We need these little lakes, and if they're not there, we need to create them there. And we can't build in the middle of these lakes because it's going to flood, right? If you build in a low-lying area in Florida, it's going to flood. So this subdivision was torn down, became a lake. It's a beautiful lake right now, but it's helped that area. And as I mentioned, I don't believe Ridgewood Estates has ever flooded again. Actually, after that point, even though there was a lot of negative publicity about Ridgewood Estates, I personally actually bought an investment house just a couple streets away from where my mother-in-law lived at that point. And Ridgewood Estates has been a very stable area. It's a great location. And even though it says this 100-year flood, it's proven the test of time now, because we've had a lot of rain, and now we're having newer homes built 5 miles even east of that are now flooding. Well, why are these homes flooding? So back to Laurel Meadows. It has a lot of the same characteristics that I think back at Ridgewood Estates. You had this area that's never flooded, and what's changed, right? Why is it now flooding? Well, when you built in there, did it have all this development around you? And did this development around you impact where you're at? And what's the probability? Well, that's obviously makes sense. You know, if maybe you weren't in a low area, but because of all the other things that were built, now you are the low area and you're going to flood. But another thing I know people don't want to talk about, it's this, when you say it, people, I start getting the likes to the dislikes quickly, but it's not a conspiracy theory. I don't think so. But people say this is a Florida problem, Florida floods. Well, you know what? I'm seeing problems all over. I remember going to California a year and a half ago, and when I flew into LA, there was so much snow there. In fact, there was snow on the Hollywood letters. Now, when I lived in California, I always remember we were in a drought, right? And last time I was in California, it was raining all the time, and we're now having these problems with mudslides. And if you look at the weather patterns of the world right now, the world, not just Sarasota, we're having a lot of intensity, and it's that thing we don't want to talk about, right? Climate change. I've seen the water level rise, and where I live, personally, I live on an acre of land. I have a lake in my backyard. I feel like I'm very high up, but this last tropical storm, Debbie, that came through, it rained all night, and when I woke up, the lake was surrounding almost the front of my house, and it was about 2 or 3 feet deep on the road. So we were trapped in our house after Tropical Storm Debbie because of the water. Now, I talked to a neighbor, my home's 30 plus years old, and she said, I've been here 29 years, I've never seen this much water. Is it possible that we're just seeing the water rise, and the areas that were okay, they were fine, they're built to sustain the storms. Now, if the water level continues to rise, that we could have a problem? Just a thought, right? Now, I, as a real estate agent, of course, I'm very conscious of properties that I would buy or help a customer with and tell them what to do and not do. And I have an opinion, and of course, you don't want to be in a flood zone. I mean, Florida, for the most part, is in a flood zone, but you don't want to be in an area where it's most likely to flood. You want to feel like you're in a safe area, and it's important that you do your homework. Flood maps change, and what could be in a flood zone at one point later on may be in a flood zone, and what would change that? Circumstantial things around the area. So you got to pay attention to that. Does it mean that everything here is going to flood? No, you just got to be a little more conscious of your decisions, because having a house flood where you don't have flood insurance is horrific. It could wipe you out financially. I feel very sorry for the people in Laurel Meadows. They didn't ask for that. A lot of them had their homes built. They've never had problems. Like my mother-in-law that lived in her home for 19 years, we didn't see it coming and didn't expect that. And it was just kind of awkward that she had refinanced her house 3 months earlier and that was paid for. But if that had not taken place, it would have been very devastating for her at her age to have had that situation happen. So you got to be careful. I don't think it's a Florida problem. I think it's a world problem. We are having problems happen all over the world. You have to be conscious of what you buy, regardless of where it's at. So in closing, I hope I've been helpful. Again, my name is Troy Funk. I have a website that will show you properties for sale all over the state of Florida. And of course, you're gonna wanna make sure you're not in a low-lying area. But if you wanna look at real estate, certainly look at my website. If I can be a resource to you, certainly reach out to me. I hope I've been helpful to you. If I have, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button if you're not a subscriber, and I wish you well.